our final speaker, who is Johnbosco Nwogbo, who is from the ONIT, and he'll talk about outsourcing in the private sector and why it doesn't work.
Thank you so much, everyone. Works. Does it? Can you hear me? Ah, great. Thank you so much. Good morning. I'm really sorry that I arrived extremely late. I've had the worst morning ever. I said to myself while I was walking here that if you leave your house at 6 a.m., even if you hitch a ride on a tortoise, you should get to London by 10 o'clock. But it didn't happen. All right, so I'm going to talk about, Thomas talked about kind of the way that I kind of categorize what Thomas talks a lot about is the need for proper funding. What we as we talk about is the need for whatever funding is available to be utilized in the right way, in a way that works in terms of providing a high quality service to users, but also in a way that is most efficient, so the least spending possible. It's not really exciting stuff. So at the very end, I will invite you to take some action with me, right? Because obviously I just want to give you information. I want to try and put that information in a context in which you understand not just why is it telling us about this stuff, but how can we use this stuff to have an impact in society. All right, so we on it. I imagine everybody here knows about We On It, right? I don't want to spend a lot of your time telling you about We On It. If you're not already on our email list, please do join our email list, and I'll shout URL at the end. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so I thought that it was useful to start by painting a picture of how we are approaching this general election, right? So we, first of all, said we wanted to do two things, right? The first thing we wanted to do was to secure a base in Parliament that allowed us to continue our fight for public ownership, whether it's of the NHS, obviously, but also of other things, right? You would be quite surprised how impactful and powerful the voice of one MP can be. A very good example is Caroline Lucas and Clive Lewis working together on water privatization policy, and we were able to raise this issue, in many ways, raise its political salience in a way that it would not have if they did not exist. So we set out to find a way to find those people who make us promises about what they're going to do in Parliament, so that once the election is over, we're able to go back to them and say, all right, you said you were going to do A, B, and C thing. Now is the time to put your money where your mouth is. Right, so we created the pledge for the NHS. So the pledge for the NHS has three ingredients. One of them is commit that you're going to fight for £40 billion more into the NHS every year over the lifetime of the next Parliament. Number two, commit to ending NHS or fighting to end NHS outsourcing. And number three, commit to reinstating or fighting to reinstate the health secretary's legal duty to provide health services to everyone. At the moment, I think we are over 450 candidates who have taken the pledge. And I'm not 100% sure of the exact number because it takes quite a lot of effort to keep the website updated on this stuff. But we are over 450, which is really good because by my count, I think we are between 40 and 50 of those who I feel are fairly guaranteed to win their seats, right? So we have a really solid base of people who are very likely to win the next election, who have committed to these three specific policies. So pretty much on July the 6th, because I imagine a lot of them finding out whether or not they won on the 5th, we'll be able to send them an email and say, congratulations, you won. Now let's get to work, right? So that's the first step. The second step was that we thought that if we were able to produce research that paints a picture for people, the implications of privatization, but also shows them what the opportunities are for whoever the next government is. I think the vast majority of people expect it to be the Labour Party. If I told you that I wasn't expecting that, you probably laugh in my face, even if you necessarily don't want it, or even if you don't necessarily want it. But we wanted to paint a picture of what the opportunities would be for the Labour government, the incoming Labour government. Right? So the first thing we did was that on the 3rd of June, we launched a piece of research that showed that 94% of all outsourcing contracts for services were coming out for renewal, or rather were expiring within the next parliament, right? And we specifically said contracts for services because obviously we don't expect the NHS to make gloves or what other things do they use in the NHS? I don't even know. Just gloves. I know gloves. All right. Sorry? Well, I think that we can have publicly owned drug manufacturers, but at the moment we don't have the infrastructure, so we don't necessarily expect the NHS to make that anymore. But we do expect the NHS to do knee replacement surgeries or hernia operations, or to employ the people who clean the hospitals or do the catering, and so on and so forth, right? So we looked at those kinds of contracts specifically, and we said, and we found that 94% of those contracts are scheduled to expire within the next parliament. So that was the first thing we put out. The second thing we put out, which is what I want to spend the bulk of my presentation talking about, is our analysis of how much has left the NHS in profits since pretty much the 1st of January of 2012. And obviously you will know that the context for this is the Health and Social Care Act that was passed in 2012. It was not passed on the 1st of January of 2012, but we asked for data starting from the 1st of January. Next slide. Yeah, so just to put that in context as well of what I said earlier on, we thought that having this kind of data allows us to inject ourselves into the conversation about the NHS in a way that appears to lean into what Labour has been saying about quote-unquote reforms, right? They're saying, we're not going to put more money into the NHS. Putting money into the NHS is not the solution to fixing the NHS. We're going to reform it. Well, here is a reform that will save you £10 million every single week. If you're serious about reforms that will save you money, right? So that's, as I said earlier on, I wanted to spend the bulk of my presentation talking about how we arrived at that figure of £10 million a week, or £6.7 billion since 2012. And I said earlier on, the context obviously is the Health and Social Care Act. I put this in here, saying you'll find differing analysis of how much of the NHS budget goes to private providers, right? The King's Fund say between 6 and 7%, but you'll find analysis that say it's around 20%. And my sense is that it depends on how you define private providers, right? The 20% analysis includes charities. It has some really persuasive arguments as to why charities should be treated as private providers, but it doesn't. The 7% one only includes for-profit private providers. Our analysis suggests that it might be around 10%, but ours also does not include charities, right? So the reason I say it might be around 10% is that we looked at 72,000 contracts worth a total of 130 billion pounds, and my thought process was that if you look at what percentage of the entire budget of the NHS over those 12 years we looked at is 130 billion pounds, right? So roughly 10%. Next slide. Why did I put this slide here again? The reason was that I thought it was useful to kind of make the point that we are the first people who have talked about this, right? The profits the private companies are extracting from the NHS have been a worry for a lot of people. And these articles and a lot of incredible work done by organizations like Corporate Watch kind of lay the groundwork for some of what we've done. That is why I have this slide. The next slide. All right, so our analysis looked at all NHS outsourcing contracts given out between January of 2012 and May of 2024. We looked at 72,258 contracts worth a total of £130.7 billion. NHS contracts tend to be categorized under a number of items, right? You have works like Liverpool NHS Foundation Trust has a project to rebuild their elevators. That's categorized as works. Products, we talked about the gloves. Supplies, services, what I mentioned earlier. And then there's some described as not applicable or not specified. And a very good example of a not specified contract is some NHS Foundation trusts or trusts have contracts with Royal Mail to deliver letters to patients, right? So that's what that is. So that's what it covers. The £6.7 billion covers contract for everything. Now I'm going to come to what amount of profit has gone out from just services, right? So if you were saying, well, it's not realistic to say we should take contracts back for, say, rebuilding Liverpool hospitals elevators, well, we could exclude that for you and still a significant amount. What it doesn't include, this is increasingly important because on Twitter, every time we post about this, everybody seems to have in mind something that it should include. So I thought it's useful to mention that it does not include GPs and pharmacists and dentists. It does include APMS contracts. If you're familiar with what APMS contracts are, there are three kinds of GP contracts, GMS contracts, PMS contracts. I don't want to go into explaining it. But APMS contracts, alternative provider medical services contracts, are pretty much the doorway to the NHS for private corporations like Centene, because it doesn't require the people who own and run the GP surgeries to be people who are certified to practice medicine. So it does include APMS contracts, but not other GP contracts. And then it does not include the big COVID contracts, where it doesn't include track and trace. What else? All the contracts that Matt Hancock gave to his friends. It doesn't include it. The main reason for that is that those contracts were given by the Department for Health and Social Care, and the data we got were data for NHS bodies, so NHS England, ICSs, NHS trusts. Next one. So in terms of the kind of literal analysis, as I said earlier on, where over 72,000 contracts would have been nightmarish for me to have manually, or even using some tricky formulas on spreadsheet, try and work out the average profits from all of these contracts literally, right? So what I did was that I selected what I think is a very representative sample, right? So we selected every contract over the value of £1 million. Those made up about 12% of the contracts in terms of number, so 9,093 contracts. But they made up, very interestingly, 94% of the contracts in terms of value. So they made up about just over 123 billion pounds. Now, what we did was that we kind of looked at these companies, and what we tried to do is find what their profit margins were, right? And where we did that was, and actually we got quite a lot of help from Tussle. I don't know if people know what Tussle is. It's not the charity that feeds, that hands out food parcels. This one is a company that helps private companies get public contracts, that helps private companies apply for, tender for, and run our public services. So they're pretty much on the opposite end of what we only does. But they must not have found us threatening enough that they provided us with a lot of support for finding out some of this. So we used Bureau Van Dyke, that's owned by Moody's, the rating agency, to identify the profit margins of the company. Something I should say here is that we didn't look at each each contract's profit margin, we looked at the profit margin of the company that's running it, and we assumed that they're making about the same profit margin on this the revenue from an NHS contract as they would make from revenue from any other source, right? Or as they would make from overall revenue, which is their profit margin, right? So we looked at their profit margins, and if you go to the next slide, next one. Yep. So what we found was that they made, in terms of percent, 5.18%. It's not written here for some reason. Sorry. 5.18% profits on their NHS contracts. And that amounted to, we applied the finding for, thank you very much. We applied the finding for £1 million contracts to everything. And what we found was that that they took out £6.7 billion from the NHS, or just £10 million a week, which is a significant amount of money. And we looked at contracts for services specifically, so surgeries, tests, physiotherapy, and a whole bunch of things that the NHS already does in some places. They're just outsourcing contracts for them in other places, which means the NHS can do it. It just needs to build the capacity to do it. And obviously, we found that £5.2 billion went out from the NHS in profits, or about £7.8 million a week went out. I have these two things here just to illustrate what this money could do. The King George Hospital in Ilford recently opened 2 operating theatres. The both of them cost £14 million to build. What this suggests is that we could literally be building 1 operating theatre in the NHS every week with the money that's going out every week from just contracts for services. The RCN has been campaigning for a student loan forgiveness scheme for NHS nurses, and the Exchequer said it would cost £235 million to fund that. I don't know if you can see what's at the bottom there. It says what has left the NHS in profits over the last 12 years would fund that scheme for 22 years. Next one. All right. So if you would like to find this research, it's weonit.org.uk/10 million a week. It occurred to me that I could change the URL, so I changed it to weonit.org.uk/profits, so it's easier. Now, the exercise I wanted us to do at the end. How many of us here use Twitter? Come on. I see all of you on Twitter. Where are you? All right. If you use Twitter, please, can you take your phone out, type in weonit.org.uk/profits, and tweet the research out there with a message. The reason it's important, and what I'm going to be spending my time doing for the rest of this campaign and for the next 6 months, really, is getting this research into the public consciousness and into the public conversation. It's really, really important. We already had Carol Vodman share the research when it came out. On Monday, I'll be reaching out to people who've supported our campaigns in the past, like Stephen Fry and others, and asking them to also speak publicly against NHS privatization from the point of view of what it's costing us in profits. And if everyone in this room were to tweet right now, weonit.org.uk/profits, with a message saying, outsourcing is not a neutral choice, it's not just about, it doesn't matter. Privately, millions of pounds leave our NHS every single week that should go into providing that service to everyone. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here.